Good evening, I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Tuesday, March 29th. Tonight, a newly tabled climate plan projects the oil and gas industry will need to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 42% by 2030. Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault tabled the plan today in Parliament. Oil and gas accounts for more than 1/4 of Canada's total emissions, and the sector's carbon footprint has grown 20% since 2005. Minister Guilbeault is forecasting that electricity emissions will be almost zero by the end of the decade. But he notes that it will take longer to see real progress from the transportation sector, which accounts for 25% of current emissions. Well, after 2 years of the pandemic, the Quebec government is making moves to reform its beleaguered healthcare system. Quebec's health minister has unveiled a sweeping 3-year plan to reform the province's healthcare. It includes ending mandatory overtime for nurses, investing in home care, hospital upgrades, and better access to data. The government plans to introduce a single portal that Quebecers can use to access frontline health services. Next door, the Ontario government is also launching a plan that includes a measure to make permanent a $3 an hour raise for personal support workers. The plan to stay open would also see the province recruit more nurses in underserviced communities and maintain a stockpile of personal protective equipment. New legislation would require the province to have a provincial emergency plan that is updated every 5 years. On the other side of the country, BC's finance minister says home buyers will soon be protected by provincial regulations that include a cooling-off period. Selena Robinson says the Property Law Amendment Act would give buyers time to consider what they're buying and to have a home inspection done. She says it will set an amount of time that buyers have to get out of a real estate deal, and it will include any possible financial costs involved in retracting an offer. Professor Sir Somerville from UBC says the changes would give buyers more time for due diligence, but it also allows purchasers to make offers without consequences, which could put the seller at a disadvantage. He says it also would not make housing less expensive. In the North, Nunavut's Integrity Commissioner has ruled that a territorial cabinet minister indeed breached his duty to remain objective and impartial. This is because he approved his spouse as acting Deputy Minister of Human Resources for a short period in December. Human Resources and Finance Minister Adam Lightstone remains in cabinet at this time, but he is stepping away from his duties while the Legislative Assembly reviews the Commissioner's report. It found Mr. Lightstone did not follow Nunavut's Integrity Act when he approved senior staff's recommendation to choose his spouse. On the East Coast, Nova Scotia is once again receiving power from the Muskrat Falls hydroelectric facility in Labrador. This comes after a malfunction forced a month-long shutdown. A spokesperson for Nova Scotia Power says service from Muskrat Falls resumed on March 24th. Officials say the transmission link had to be shut down last month after a false fire alarm. The transmission link connects the Labrador generating station with Newfoundland and the line to Nova Scotia. The link has been plagued with software issues, leading to ongoing delays with the Muskrat Falls project, which is already years behind schedule. All right, well, meanwhile, 4 provinces are teaming up on a plan to build small nuclear reactors. Ontario, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, and Alberta say the goal is to meet domestic energy need and transition toward cleaner energy. The first 300-megawatt plant is to be built in Darlington, Ontario by 2028, and Saskatchewan is to break ground on a site as early as the mid-2030s. Moving to the Canadian crypto industry, as a new council has been formed to advocate for a national strategy for cryptocurrency and digital assets. The Canadian Web3 Council includes representatives from companies like Wealthsimple and Ether Capital. Its aim is to move the needle on regulation of digital assets in Canada. The group's founders say the crypto industry has grown into a multi-trillion-dollar asset class, and it's time for the government to work with industry leaders to ensure thoughtful policy is formed. Tributes are coming in for Ottawa Senators owner Eugene Melnyk. The NHL team says he passed away yesterday at the age of 62. A Toronto native and a businessman, Mr. Melnyk bought the Senators in 2003 and saw them play in the 2007 Stanley Cup final. He He was also an honorary colonel of the Canadian Armed Forces and a successful thoroughbred racehorse breeder who was inducted into the Canadian Horse Racing Hall of Fame in 2017. All right, stay with us. After the break, we take a look at fighter jets. We'll have an interview with Richard Shimuka on the government's F-35 announcement up next. That and, of course, more news from around the world on Forum Daily, so stay with us. The decade-long search for a new fighter jet to replace aging CF-18s has come full circle. The Liberal government has announced negotiations with U.S. defense giant Lockheed Martin to purchase 88 F-35s. But it's still not clear how much the aircraft will cost or when delivery is expected. The move into final negotiations for the F-35 has also prompted questions about whether Ottawa should have pressed ahead with its original deal for them more than a decade ago. In a recent op-ed to the National Post, one expert says the entire process has demonstrated shortcomings with defense procurement in Canada. Richard Shimuka, senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, says one of the main lessons from the F-35 selection process is that political considerations trumped expertise. Well, he joins us now to tell us more about this. Sir, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me.
So 10 years ago, we were looking at these F-35 jets, and now we're right back where we started. Mr. Shimuka, walk us through the history of this procurement process.
So the F-35 project is a little bit more complex than most other defense procurements because back in the early 2000s, we joined what was called the Joint Strike Fighter Partnership Program, which was an industrial coalition of countries that were basically going to construct and produce the fighter as it went through in the future. And so that didn't actually necessitate us to acquire the F-35 at that time. But what it did was allow Canadian companies the opportunity to actually produce components that would go on to every single F-35 build. So that occurred in 2006 when we signed an MOU with the United States. And then for the next couple of years after that, the Department of National Defense and other parts of the Canadian government assessed what were the potential options. And then they selected the F-35 in 2010 under the Conservative government at the time. This was a sole source selection. What was found was that this aircraft was basically significantly less costly, much more capable, and provided better industrial benefits than any other potential option at the time. And therefore, they just advanced it as a sole source acquisition. About 2 years later, there was a lot of political rancor and sort of controversy that had emerged. And then so the Conservative government at that time basically put a pause on it. They tried a reset where they would actually reassess the procurement. And then 2 years from that reset, they actually decided again to acquire the F-35. But what happened was that in the United States, there was a premature release of information, and then the Conservative government, facing an election in the coming year, decided to just put that on hold. As we know, they lost that election, and then you had the Liberal government of Justin Trudeau. They came to power, and who had actually said that he was not going to buy the F-35 under any circumstances. Basically, they realized that wasn't actually a tenable way, so they kind of concocted a potential capability gap where they would acquire a small number of Super Hornets, which was probably the most viable competitor to the F-35. After that point, that deal fell through itself, in part because of a trade dispute between Bombardier and Boeing, who manufactured the F-35. And so then they bought some surplus Australian Hornets, which is basically their version of the CF-18 is what we currently fly. They were getting rid of them because they were buying F-35s. And then you had the competition that took basically about four years or so. And then yesterday was basically the final announcement from that competition that we were actually going to again buy the F-35.
Quite a long process there. Now, you're saying that there are some lessons that we can learn from this process. So what are some main lessons that policymakers can take away from this F-35 procurement process? Just about a minute left, sir.
I think the easiest one is to look at subject matter experts. If you look at what the Department of National Defense was saying in 2010, they were clearly stating this aircraft was less costly, more capable, better industrial benefits. And they were basically on the nose with a lot of their assessments. Everything that's happened since has basically been a lot of political kind of debate that was not really centered on what was actually being said by the bureaucracy. And if for politicians, I think it's really helpful to think about that, because it's easy enough to twist issues or twist narratives or whatever to suit political purposes. But frankly, we're much poorer off in terms of the money that we spent wasted over the last 10 years on this. And also we have an obsolescent fighter capability that we're kind of trying to make work for far past what its due date was.
Mm-hmm. Some good food for thought there, sir. Thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily and sharing with us.
Thanks for having me.
More news to come after the break, but first we take a look at the federal government's child care rebate program. We'll have an interview with the CEO of the Canadian Child Care Federation up next, now that Ontario has signed on to Ottawa's child care plan. Stay with us. Ontario Premier Doug Ford and the Prime Minister have officially announced a deal. It will see parents of children aged 5 and under in childcare start getting rebates in May. Ontario is the last jurisdiction to sign on to Ottawa's plan to bring childcare fees down to an average of $10 a day by the end of 2025. The $10.2 billion deal includes rebates retroactive to April 1st as part of a fee reduction of up to 25%. Parents will see a further cost reduction in December. Well, joining us now to tell us more about the federal child care program and what this deal means for Ontario is the CEO of the Canadian Child Care Federation, Don Giesbrecht. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you very much.
So let's start with this deal, sir. What does this deal between the Premier and the federal government mean for parents in Ontario?
Well, it means that they're going to start saving money as of April 1st, which is probably one of the biggest takeaways for Ontario families, no doubt. Ontario has the highest childcare fees in all of Canada. And as of April 1st, they're going to see a 25% reduction, as you mentioned, retroactive once the funding starts moving, and then another 25% reduction by the end of December. All in for this year, that is over $1.1 billion that is going to go back to parents.
All right. Well, staying on the topic of these rebates, who qualifies and how much can families expect to get back in May when this program starts to roll out?
Right. So you have to have your children in a licensed and regulated childcare space. That is first and foremost. How the money will start to actually move, that's to be decided yet. If we look to Saskatchewan, who did something similar, but they did retroactively to July 1st of last year, the money moved to the childcare programs, and then the childcare programs rebated parents directly. In some cases, parents received checks for the difference, but in most cases it was a credit that was applied to their account. But either way, it's going to bring fee relief to parents in the immediate.
And we do know there are further reductions scheduled for December. So what could these rebates look like by the end of the year?
Yeah, so, of course, they're going to be reducing fees immediately. They also want to put a cap on fees for everybody in the licensed and regulated sector as well. So it's not like, they're going to decrease on one side and increase on the other side, right? So they're going to try to bring some sanity, if you will, to the fees that are being charged in Ontario. And the next reduction by the end of December, like you mentioned, will be another 25% on that lower amount that's going to be in place starting very soon now in April.
So what does this mean for the child care centers themselves, who are likely to face a higher demand following this?
It's going to put a lot of pressure on them. Certainly that was the other important arm of the announcement yesterday between the Prime Minister and the Premier, that Ontario has a plan over the next several years to create 86,000 new spaces. And we know that as everybody starts going back to work or has been going back to work, demand for childcare services is certainly increasing along with that. And with reduced fees, we know that if you build it, they will come. And there will be a large demand on childcare programs to expand their services. But taken with that, we have to also keep an eye on the early learning and childcare workforce, right? You can't open a space without a qualified staff to work in it. And so that is a piece that has to also be balanced out and planned for and strategized for in terms of the expansion of services, both both going forward as well as supporting the existing workforce in Ontario's childcare sector.
Definitely. Now, this program, the goal of this program is to have $10 a day childcare by the end of 2025. So what would this likely look like province-wide and countrywide?
Yeah. On average, and that is the key, the federal government has a policy goal and a funding goal of making sure that parents of preschool age children, at least at the start, are paying no more than that average of $10 a day. So that's going to mean a really fundamental shift in how childcare services are funded and delivered in this country. Right now, we have what we call a market demand, where childcare fees tend to be charged to the market to support their operations. What we're now going to have to see is a shift to supply side. So in other words, funding the operations so the savings can be passed on to parents. It can't just be through subsidy systems, which are the tried and established ways of helping support affordability. But we also know subsidy systems are one of the reasons why we got ourselves into this mess with regards to high childcare fees in this country. So it really is a complete reworking of childcare sectors across Canada.
Lots to keep our eyes on as this program unfolds. Sir, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.
All right, up next, we take a look at today's international headlines on Forum Daily, so stay tuned. We'll be right back. Russia's military says it is cutting back operations near Ukraine's capital and the northern city of Chernihiv. It appears to be a goodwill gesture as talks aimed at ending the war got underway in Istanbul, Turkey. But it comes as Russian troops struggle to make major advances in the face of stiff Ukrainian resistance. Deputy Russian Defense Minister Alexander Fomin suggests that there has been progress at the talks. He says negotiations on preparing an agreement on Ukraine's neutrality and non-nuclear status, as well as on giving Ukraine security guarantees, are turning to practical matters. The head of the International Renewable Energy Agency says radical action is needed. This to shift away from fossil fuels and ensure global warming doesn't pass dangerous thresholds. A report published by the agency today concludes $5.7 trillion in renewable energy investments are needed globally each year until 2030. This to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Accord. The agency suggests that investments of $700 billion be diverted away from the fossil fuel sector annually to avoid creating wells, pipelines, and power plants that can't be used anymore. Saudi Arabia's oil industry continues to deal with terrorist attacks, and the kingdom's oil chief says markets are going through a jittery period. He reiterated that the kingdom's ability to ensure energy security is no longer guaranteed. Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman said cross-border attacks by Yemen's Houthi rebels, who are backed by Iran, threaten the kingdom's ability to supply the world with energy. Oil prices, already at their highest in years, have shot up further amid attacks from the Houthis on Saudi Arabia. The kingdom is OPEC's largest oil producer. In the east, a two-phase lockdown of Shanghai's 26 million people is testing the limits of China's hardline zero-COVID strategy. The city entered the second day on Tuesday of the first phase of a lockdown, including the Pudong Financial District and adjacent areas. The measures, which confine residents to their homes and close non-essential businesses, are to be lifted on Friday. Then the area on the opposite side of the river dividing the city will go under lockdown. Shanghai is a hub for finance, manufacturing, and trade. Authorities are working to ensure food supplies and have converted gymnasiums and exhibition centers to house patients, most of whom show no symptoms. Australia's government presented a budget plan to deal with inflation ahead of elections. Economic measures include cutting the tax on gasoline in half in a bid to help cushion the impact of rising prices and to win votes at elections that must be held by May 21st. Treasury Department documents show that inflation is expected to reach 4.5% in the current fiscal year. It is being fueled by the Ukraine war, supply chain disruptions, and flooding disasters in central and eastern Australia. South of the border, the U.S. House Committee investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol has voted unanimously to hold two advisors to former President Donald Trump in contempt of Congress. The trade advisor, Peter Navarro, and communications aide, Dan Scavino, have refused to comply with subpoenas. A recommendation of criminal charges now goes to the full House, and if approved there, would be sent to the Justice Department, which has the final say on prosecution. In the UK, British police say they are fining 20 people over parties held by the Prime Minister's staff during coronavirus lockdowns. The Metropolitan Police Force said it would not identify the recipients of the fixed penalty notices, though Mr. Johnson's office has said it will reveal if he gets one. Dozens of politicians and officials have been investigated over allegations that the government broke COVID-19 social gathering rules during the pandemic. Actor Will Smith has apologized to Chris Rock for slapping the comic in the face on stage at Sunday's Academy Awards. In a statement on Instagram, Mr. Smith wrote he was out of line and wrong and is embarrassed by his actions. He also apologized to the Film Academy, Oscar producers, and viewers. This was after winning the Best Actor award on Sunday. The Academy condemned Mr. Smith's violent behavior on Monday. We end our cast in Japan, as people across the country are celebrating the peak cherry blossom viewing season 1 week after the lifting of COVID-19 restrictions. Trees are in full bloom in many parts of Japan. The peak in Tokyo was on Sunday, attracting many people who had avoided participating in the national tradition for 2 years because of the pandemic. At many parks, viewers were requested not to gather under the trees for drinking parties, which is a traditional way of celebrating the season. This was part of continuing antivirus measures as cases rise. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily News.